The whole thread. Episode 3. The how, what they did. The receipts. Episode 2 showed you the blueprint. A document written in 1975 with 8 targets, 8 methods, a budget, and a timeline. This episode is not the blueprint. This episode is the construction crew. The names, the dates, the money, the specific documented operations that built the world you are living in right now. All of this is in the public record. Some of it was declassified under pressure. Some of it was published because the people who did it didn't think anyone was paying close enough attention to put it together. They were wrong. One more thing before we start. The thread doesn't start in 2001. It doesn't start in 1963. It doesn't start in 1913. Follow it far enough, and you end up standing in front of something very old. We'll get there. Part 1. The Five Dynasties, 1897 to 1950. To understand what happened in 1910, you need to understand who was in the room. Between roughly 1897 and 1950, 5 family networks accumulated a level of coordinated influence over American institutions that had no precedent in recorded U.S. history. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Harriman, Ford, and the Rothschild-Morgan axis, the transatlantic banking architecture that connected European capital to American industrial expansion. These were not competitors. They were documented collaborators. Their foundations shared trustees. Their legal teams overlapped. Their philanthropic arms funded the same institutions in the same years. Let me show you what each one controlled, and why that specific domain. Rockefeller. Oil, medicine, education, religion. Standard Oil was broken up by the Supreme Court in 1911, and Rockefeller became even wealthier because he held shares in all 34 successor companies. The breakup was not a defeat. It was a restructuring. The same year Standard Oil was broken up, the Flexner Report, funded by Rockefeller's General Education Board, eliminated 60% of American medical schools. We'll come back to that. Carnegie, Steel, Education, International Law. Carnegie funded the standardization of American education, universal curriculum, standardized testing, the Carnegie Unit, still used to measure high school credits today. He also funded the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which shaped us foreign policy doctrine through the 20th century. His foundation's 1934 report explicitly called for rewriting American history textbooks to support internationalism. That is in the Reese Committee Congressional Investigation record. Harriman. Railroads, eugenics. Harriman's wife, Mary Harriman, funded Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory on Long Island, the primary institutional home of American eugenics research. Cold Spring Harbor produced the research that was directly cited in Nazi racial hygiene laws. The German government acknowledged the American eugenics program as the inspiration for their own. That is documented in the Nuremberg trial records. Ford. Manufacturing, media, anti-Semitic propaganda. Henry Ford published a 4-volume series called The International Jew between 1920 and 1922. In his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which had a circulation of 700,000. Adolf Hitler kept a portrait of Henry Ford on his office wall and cited him by name in Mein Kampf as an inspiration. Ford received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from the Nazi government in 1938, the highest civilian honor Germany gave to foreigners. Ford Motor Company's German subsidiary used slave labor during World War II. These are documented facts. Morgan. Finance, infrastructure, the architecture of the modern American banking system. J.P. Morgan personally stopped 2 American financial panics, 1895 and 1907, by deploying private capital to stabilize the system. Both times, the United States government did not have the resources to act. A private banker had more financial power than the federal government of the United States. That is not an opinion. That is the documented historical record. And that fact, that a private banker was more powerful than the government, is what made 1910 possible. Part 2. Jekyll Island. November 1910. 7 men board a private rail car in New Jersey under assumed names. They traveled to Jekyll Island in Georgia, a private resort owned by J.P. Morgan and his associate. They stay for 9 days. They tell no one where they are going. When they return, they have drafted what will become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This is not a theory about what happened at Jekyll Island. The participants wrote about it themselves. Senator Nelson Aldrich, chair of the Senate Finance Committee and father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, representing Rockefeller interests, Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan, Charles Norton, president of First National Bank of New York, Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's secretary, A. P. Andrews, assistant secretary of the Treasury, and Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn Loeb and Company, who had emigrated from Germany specifically to establish a U.S. central bank modeled on the European system. Frank Vanderlip wrote about the meeting himself in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935. His words, "I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed publicly that our group had gotten together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance of passage by Congress. That is a primary source. That is a participant describing why they had to hide what they were doing. Why did it have to be hidden? Because what they were building was a private central bank, owned by private shareholders, with the power to create the nation's money supply. And they knew the American public, if they understood what it was, would not accept it. The Federal Reserve was passed into law December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, when most congressmen had already gone home for the holiday. That is in the congressional record. Congressman Charles Lindbergh, Sr., father of the aviator, stood on the floor of the House and said, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signs this act, the invisible government by the money power will be legalized." That is in the congressional record. December 22, 1913. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. Its own website acknowledges its independence. It has private shareholders. Its meetings are not subject to congressional oversight in real time. It has never been fully audited. The last full independent audit of Fort Knox, where the gold that supposedly backs confidence in the U.S. financial system is stored, was conducted in 1953. Every request for a full audit since has been denied or given only limited access. That is not a theory. That is a documented absence. Part 3. The Flexner Report, 1910. Same year as Jekyll Island, different room, same family. In 1910, the Rockefeller-funded General Education Board commissioned Abraham Flexner to conduct a review of American medical schools. In 1900, the United States had over 160 medical schools. They taught competing approaches: allopathic medicine, what became conventional medicine; homeopathic, eclectic, heavily plant-based; osteopathic, naturopathic. Patients had options. Practitioners competed on outcomes. Flexner's report recommended that any medical school not teaching pharmaceutical and surgical intervention as the primary model should be defunded, delicensed, and closed. The General Education Board then donated $91 million to medical schools that adopted the Flexner model. Schools that did not adopt it lost accreditation and funding and closed. By 1935, 25 years after the report, there were 66 medical schools in the United States, down from 160. A reduction of over 58%, all teaching the same curriculum, all accredited by the same body, all producing doctors trained to prescribe and operate, and nothing else. The word quack entered common usage during this period as a dismissal term for any medical practice not aligned with the new model. It performed the same function that conspiracy theorists would perform for the CIA in 1967. A language weapon, designed to end inquiry without engaging evidence. The Rockefeller family had significant investments in pharmaceutical companies. The medical system the Flexner Report created is a primary customer for pharmaceutical products. The family that funded the elimination of competing medicine was the same family positioned to profit from the monopoly that remained. That is documented in Rockefeller family financial records and General Education Board annual reports. Primary sources. Part 4. Tesla, 1943. Nikola Tesla died alone in room 3327 on January 7, 1943. In the New Yorker Hotel, he was 86 years old. When briefly touched on Tesla in Episode 1, The Why, Tesla had not had a working laboratory in years. J.P. Morgan pulled his funding in 1903 when Morgan understood that Tesla's wireless energy transmission system would make it impossible to meter electricity, and therefore impossible to charge customers for it. 2 days after Tesla's death, before his family can retrieve his belongings, the FBI and the Office of Alien Property seized all 80 trunks of his documents, notebooks, and research. The government assigned Dr. John G. Trump of MIT, an uncle of Donald Trump, to review the materials. His official report concluded the documents contained nothing of significant value or concern. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base reviewed the same materials and disagreed. On the record, 20 trunks of Tesla's materials have never been publicly accounted for. Their location is undocumented in any declassified record. This is documented through FOIA-released FBI records, not a theory, a documented seizure with a documented gap. Why does Tesla matter to this episode? Because Tesla is the clearest single documented case of what happens to a scientist whose work threatens the existing energy and financial infrastructure. He is not unique. Royal Raymond Rife documented microscope technology that could identify cancer cells by frequency resonance. His laboratory was raided in 1939. His equipment was destroyed. He was prosecuted. His research disappeared from the medical literature. The pattern is the same every time. The technology works. It threatens an existing revenue stream, and the infrastructure that was built to protect public knowledge is used instead to bury it. Part 5. The operations. What they ran inside the building. By the 1940s, the institutional infrastructure was in place. The Federal Reserve controlled the money supply. The medical system was standardized. Education was centralized. The press was being consolidated. What runs inside that infrastructure is a different kind of documented record. These are the operations, all declassified, all primary source. Operation Paperclip 1945. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, Declassified Directive, authorized the importation of over 1,600 Nazi scientists into the United States, including SS members, including scientists who had used concentration camp prisoners as unwilling test subjects. Werner von Braun, who was an SS major, used slave labor at Mittelwerk to build V-2 rockets. He became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. His work put Americans on the moon, supposedly. The scientists who had run human experimentation programs on prisoners were brought into US military research programs. The experiments continued. The subjects changed. MKUltra, 1953 to 1973. CIA program, 150 subprojects. 80 institutions, including Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, and the University of Rochester. Research into mind control, amnesia induction, personality alteration, and the creation of programmed behavior through drugs, hypnosis, isolation, and psychological torture. LSD was administered to unwitting subjects, patients in psychiatric hospitals, prisoners, soldiers who were told they were taking something else. The goal was documented. Develop a method to make a human being do something they would not otherwise do and not remember doing it. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra records in 1973 when he learned the program was about to be investigated. 20,000 documents survived because they had been misfiled in a financial records building. They were found in 1977 through a FOIA request. Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist, was thrown from a 10th floor window in New York in 1953. His death was ruled a suicide. His family later had his body exhumed. A forensic pathologist found a blow to the head inconsistent with a fall. No one was ever charged. That is documented in the Olson family's legal proceedings. The Senate Subcommittee on Intelligence held hearings in 1977. Survivors testified. The program is confirmed. Primary source. Operation Mockingbird, already documented in Episode 2, as the press check. But let me add the detail. The Church Committee found assets in CBS, the New York Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek, the Associated Press International, Reuters, and the Miami Herald, among others. Some journalists were paid directly. Some traded access for favorable coverage. Some were recruited out of journalism school. Some were CIA officers who took press credentials as cover. Carl Bernstein, one of the journalists who broke Watergate, investigated and published the full scope of Mockingbird in Rolling Stone in October 1977. His sourcing included CIA Director William Colby's own congressional testimony. It ran once. It was not followed up by the mainstream press, because the mainstream press was the story. COINTELPRO, 1956 to 1971. FBI counterintelligence program. Officially, monitor domestic threats. Actually, infiltrate, disrupt, discredit, and destroy domestic political organizations the FBI deemed to be dangerous. Martin Luther King Jr. The FBI sent him a letter in 1964, documented in the congressional record, that included recordings of his personal life and a suggestion that he kill himself before his Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. The letter is real. It is in the National Archives. Fred Hampton, 21 years old, chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party, was shot dead in his bed at 4 a.m. on December 4, 1969. Chicago police conducted the raid. An FBI informant had provided the floor plan of his apartment. Hampton had been drugged beforehand. The coroner found a sedative in his blood. He was shot twice in the head at close range while unconscious. A federal grand jury concluded in 1976 that the raid was a planned assassination. No one was convicted. COINTELPRO was exposed in 1971, not by the government, not by the press, by a group of activists who broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, stole the files, and mailed copies to journalists and congressional members. The program's existence was only confirmed because someone broke in and took the evidence. That is how much of this history was discovered. Not through official disclosure. Through leaks. Through people willing to put themselves at risk to hand you the documents. Part 6. How far back the thread goes. I told you at the start that the thread doesn't begin in 1913. Let me show you why. 45 BC. Julius Caesar replaces the 13-month lunar calendar with the 12-month solar calendar. The month named after Thoth, the Egyptian god of hidden knowledge, writing, and wisdom, is removed from the calendar entirely. 325 AD. The Council of Nicaea. The Roman Emperor Constantine convenes a council of bishops and decides which texts are scripture and which are hearsay. This is documented in Eusebius of Caesarea's own account, a participant and eyewitness. The texts that describe direct access to the divine without an intermediary are excluded. The texts that require a priestly institution to mediate between humanity and God are included. 1209 to 1255. The Cathar Genocide. The Church launches a military crusade against a population in southern France, the only crusade ever launched against European Christians. The Cathars believed the material world was a trap, and that the divine spark was within every human being. They did not require priests. They did not require tithes. Their theology made the institutional church unnecessary. 1 million people killed. The Dominican order created specifically to hunt them. The medieval Inquisition created specifically to find whoever survived. 1307. The Knights Templar are arrested simultaneously across France on October 13th, Friday the 13th, on orders from the French king and with the cooperation of the Pope. Their assets are seized. Their treasury, the contents of which have never been publicly accounted for, disappears. 4040. The printing press. For the first time in recorded history, it becomes possible to distribute information faster than institutions can suppress it. 1517. Luther's 95 Theses. The first document that traveled faster than the institution could respond. The Reformation, enabled by the printing press, was the first documented information disruption in Western history. 1945. The Nag Hammadi Library is found buried in a jar in the Egyptian desert. 52 texts that the church had declared hearsay and burned every copy of, texts that describe the divine spark within every human being, the suppression of that knowledge by blind and arrogant powers, and the path back to the fullness. They survived because someone buried them in a jar, 1600 years ago, hoping someone on the other side would find them. We found them. Here's what every operation in this episode has in common. Every single one was secret. Not classified in the way that protects national security, secret in the way that protects the people doing it from the people they are doing it to. Jekyll Island was secret because if the public knew that 7 men, representing 1/4 of the world's wealth, were designing the American monetary system, they would not accept it. The Flexner Report was presented as an independent academic review. The funding source was not disclosed in the report. MKUltra was secret because no human being, asked directly, would consent to what they were doing. COINTELPRO was secret because it was illegal. The FBI was operating outside its legal mandate, targeting American citizens for their political beliefs. And in at least one documented case, Fred Hampton participating in the assassination of a 21-year-old man in his bed. When an operation has to be hidden from the people it affects, that is not governance. That is predation. And here's the thing about 2026. Most of what I just told you is not secret anymore. The documents are public. The testimony is in the congressional record. The participants wrote memoirs. The court cases produced evidence. The operations are no longer hidden. They rely instead on something else. The assumption that even when people see all of it, they won't be able to hold it in frame simultaneously. That the scale will feel too large. That the implications will feel too uncomfortable. That the easier path is to decide it can't be true. That assumption is what this series is built to break. You've seen the blueprint. You've seen the construction crew. Episode 4 is who specifically is running the building. Right now, the names, the organizations, the documented connections, and the present tense. The thread runs from the oldest recorded civilization to the news you read this morning. It has always been the same thread.